The year was 1967, and Mary Catherine Jenkins stood on the tarmac at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, watching the heat waves ripple off the concrete like liquid glass. She was 23 years old, fresh out of nursing school in Baltimore, and completely unprepared for what Vietnam was about to show her. The air smelled like jet fuel and something else she couldn't quite place, something metallic and urgent that would soon become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Mary had joined the Army Nurse Corps with the kind of idealism that only comes from never having seen war up close. She believed in duty, in service, in making a difference. Her father had fought in World War II, came home with medals and stories he never told, and she wanted to understand what that meant. She wanted to be brave like him. But standing there in the stifling heat, her uniform already soaked through with sweat, she felt anything but brave. Around her, soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, unloading supplies, barking orders, their faces blank in that particular way people develop when they've seen too much. A young private, couldn't have been more than 19, helped her with her bags and told her welcome to hell with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mary laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. Her assignment was the 71st Evacuation Hospital in Pleiku, a sprawling complex of canvas tents and hastily constructed buildings in the Central Highlands. The hospital sat just a few miles from the Cambodian border, close enough to the fighting that you could hear the artillery at night, a constant thunder that eventually became background noise. Mary arrived during what the other nurses called a quiet period, which meant they were only treating 30 or 40 wounded soldiers a day instead of hundreds. The chief nurse, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Brennan, gave her the tour with the efficiency of someone who had given it too many times before. This is the triage area. This is where we do surgery. This is where the boys go when there's nothing left we can do for them. Patricia didn't sugarcoat anything. She told Mary that most days she would work 16-hour shifts, that she would see things no nursing textbook could prepare her for, and that if she wanted to survive Vietnam with her sanity intact, she needed to learn how to turn off her emotions like flipping a light switch. Mary nodded, took notes, and privately thought that she was different, that she could handle it, that her compassion was a strength and not a liability. She was wrong about that too. The first time Mary worked a mass casualty event, it was 3 days after her arrival. A convoy had hit a booby trap on Route 14, and the helicopters started bringing in the wounded faster than the hospital could process them. The triage area became chaos, a screaming mass of blood and torn bodies and desperate voices calling for medics, for mothers, for God. Mary froze for exactly 10 seconds, staring at a soldier whose leg was hanging on by threads of muscle and skin, and then something inside her clicked into place. Her training took over, her hands moved automatically, and she became exactly what these men needed her to be. She worked for 14 hours straight that day, barely stopping to breathe, moving from patient to patient with a calm efficiency that surprised even her. When it was finally over, she walked behind one of the supply tents and threw up until there was nothing left. Then she washed her face, tied her hair back, and reported for her next shift. Patricia found her later and squeezed her shoulder without saying a word. They both understood. This was the job now. The weeks blurred together into a rhythm of blood and bandages and brief moments of dark humor that kept everyone sane. Mary learned the language of combat medicine, the shorthand and acronyms that let you communicate life and death information in seconds. She learned to assess wounds with a glance, to prioritize the salvageable over the dying, to make impossible choices with steady hands. She learned which surgeons were brilliant under pressure and which ones fell apart when things got bad. She learned that the young soldiers called her Mom, even though she was barely older than most of them, and that some of them would reach for her hand in their final moments, needing that human connection more than morphine. She learned to give them that comfort without breaking, to be strong for them even when everything inside her was screaming. But she also learned that the rules everyone followed weren't always the rules that saved lives. The hospital operated under strict military protocols, chains of command and procedures that had been developed in other wars, other times. There was a right way to do everything, from how you documented wounds, to how you requisitioned supplies, to how you interacted with the Vietnamese civilians, who sometimes ended up in their care. Most of the nurses followed these rules without question, because that's how you survived the military bureaucracy, how you kept your head down and made it home. But Mary started noticing gaps, places where the system failed the people it was supposed to protect. She saw supply requisitions that took weeks to process, while soldiers suffered without adequate pain medication. She saw treatment protocols that made sense on paper, but fell apart in the reality of jungle warfare. She saw the way certain patients were prioritized over others based on factors that had nothing to do with medical need. And she started asking questions. Her first clash with authority came over a young Vietnamese girl who was brought in with shrapnel wounds from an airstrike. The girl was maybe 8 years old, unconscious and bleeding, and the standing orders were to treat American soldiers first, South Vietnamese forces second, and civilians last. Mary was told to wait, to focus on the American casualties, to remember her priorities. But the girl was dying, bleeding out from a severed artery that Mary could fix in 10 minutes if someone would just let her work. She looked at the triage officer, a captain whose name she didn't know, and made a decision that would define the rest of her time in Vietnam. She walked past him to the girl and started working. The captain shouted at her, threatened her with insubordination charges, told her she was violating direct orders. Mary didn't stop. She clamped the artery, sutured the wound, stabilized the girl's vitals, and only then did she turn to face the consequences. The captain was furious, his face red with anger and something that might have been embarrassment. He wrote her up, filed a formal complaint, started the paperwork that would follow her for the rest of her career. But the little girl lived, and Mary decided that was a trade she could make. Patricia called her into the office that night, and Mary expected to be reprimanded, maybe even sent home. Instead, the older nurse poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle she kept hidden in her desk and told Mary a story. She talked about her own early days in Vietnam, about a soldier she had been ordered to let die because the resources were needed elsewhere, about the way his face still appeared in her dreams 15 years later. She talked about the impossible weight of command, of being responsible for hundreds of lives with never enough supplies or staff or time. And then she told Mary something that changed everything. There were other nurses, she said, scattered across Vietnam in different hospitals and field units, who were asking the same questions Mary was asking. They were finding creative ways to work around the bureaucracy, to get supplies where they were needed, to treat patients the system wanted them to ignore. They were saving lives the official way wouldn't save, but they were also taking enormous risks, breaking rules that could end their careers or worse. Patricia couldn't officially condone what they were doing, couldn't protect them if they got caught. But she could look the other way, and she could give Mary a name. The name was Captain Rebecca Walsh, a nurse stationed at the 67th Evacuation Hospital in Quy Nhon. Patricia said Rebecca was organizing what she called an underground supply network, coordinating with sympathetic doctors and medics across the country to redistribute resources where they were actually needed instead of where the paperwork said they should go. It was technically theft, Patricia explained, definitely insubordination and possibly treason, depending on who was doing the prosecuting. Mary should think very carefully before getting involved. She should consider her career, her future, her freedom. She should probably forget they ever had this conversation. Mary nodded, finished her whiskey, and asked for Rebecca's coordinates. Patricia smiled sadly and wrote them down. Mary met Rebecca 3 weeks later during a rare 2-day leave in Quy Nhon. She had expected someone older, harder, more obviously rebellious. Instead, Rebecca was 31, soft-spoken, with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous waters. They met in a small cafe near the beach, ate pho and drank iced coffee, and talked around the subject for an hour before Rebecca finally said what they both knew she was going to say. "The system is broken," she told Mary. "It's killing boys who don't have to die. It's wasting resources while people bleed out, waiting for supplies that are sitting in some warehouse because the paperwork isn't right. And a few of us have decided we're not going to let that happen anymore. We're fixing it the only way we can. We're going around the system." Rebecca explained how it worked. There were about 15 nurses involved, spread across 5 different hospitals and several field units. They had contacts among the supply officers, the helicopter pilots, the local Vietnamese who could move things across the country without attracting military attention. When one hospital had excess supplies and another was running short, they made it balance. When a treatment protocol wasn't working, they quietly implemented something better and dealt with the questions later. When a patient needed something the system said they couldn't have, they found a way to get it anyway. They kept meticulous unofficial records, tracked every item they moved, made sure nothing actually went missing, just redistributed. It wasn't stealing, Rebecca insisted. It was triage on a larger scale. It was doing their jobs the way they had sworn to do them, putting patients first, even when regulations said otherwise. But it required absolute secrecy, absolute trust, and absolute commitment. If the wrong person found out, they could all end up in prison. Was Mary willing to take that risk? Mary thought about the little Vietnamese girl, about the soldiers she had watched die waiting for supplies that existed but couldn't be accessed, about the oath she had taken to do no harm. She thought about her father and his untold stories, about what it really meant to be brave in a war, and she said yes. Rebecca reached across the table, shook her hand, and welcomed her to what they jokingly called the Underground Railroad, though they were careful never to write that name down anywhere. From that moment, Mary Jenkins was part of something bigger than herself, something necessary and dangerous and completely unofficial. She was still a combat nurse, still worked her regular shifts, still followed most of the rules most of the time. But now, she had another job too, one that would eventually erase her from history. The network operated through coded messages and carefully orchestrated meetings. Rebecca taught Mary the system, introduced her to the other nurses involved, explained the protocols they had developed to stay under the radar. They used the chaos of war as cover, moving supplies during mass casualty events when everyone was too busy to notice discrepancies. They falsified paperwork just enough to make the numbers balance without triggering audits. They developed relationships with sympathetic officers who believed in what they were doing and were willing to look the other way. And they saved lives. God, they saved so many lives. Mary started keeping her own set of records, a small notebook hidden in her footlocker, where she tracked every patient who survived because of their network, every treatment that succeeded because they had the right supplies at the right time. The numbers added up fast. Hundreds of lives in the first few months, more than 1,000 by the end of her first year. Each one was a person who might have died if they had followed the rules. A young man who got to go home to his family, a future that got to exist because a group of nurses decided that regulations mattered less than humanity. But the network's success was also its vulnerability. The more lives they saved, the more patterns they created, the more likely someone was to notice. And in the spring of 1968, someone did. His name was Major Douglas Hartwell, and he was a by-the-book logistics officer who had been sent to Vietnam to audit supply chains and identify inefficiencies. He was good at his job, meticulous and thorough, the kind of person who could spot a discrepancy in pages of numbers at a glance. And he started noticing things that didn't add up. Supplies that disappeared from one inventory and appeared in another without proper documentation. medications that were used faster than their distribution rate would suggest, patterns of helicopter flights that didn't match official missions. Hartwell was smart enough to know he was seeing something intentional, but he didn't immediately understand what or why. He started asking questions, requesting documents, interviewing staff. The nurses in the network knew they had a problem. Rebecca called an emergency meeting, bringing together as many of the core members as could safely gather. They met in a storage bunker at the 71st, cramped and hot and filled with the kind of tension that comes from knowing your freedom might be slipping away. The question was simple but impossible. Do we stop, cover our tracks, and hope Hartwell doesn't find enough evidence to prosecute? Or do we keep going, keep saving lives, and risk everything? The debate went on for hours. Some nurses argued for shutting down immediately, destroying records, returning to official protocols. Others insisted that stopping would mean condemning soldiers to die, that they had an obligation to continue regardless of personal risk. Mary listened to both sides, her mind racing through scenarios and consequences, and then she offered a third option. What if they brought Hartwell in? What if instead of hiding from him, they showed him exactly what they were doing and why? It was a massive risk, potentially suicidal if they had misjudged his character. But Mary had watched the Major during his interviews, had seen the way he reacted when he toured the hospital wards, when he talked to wounded soldiers. He wasn't a bureaucrat without a heart. He was a person trying to do his job in an impossible situation, just like they were. Maybe, just maybe, he could be made to understand. The other nurses looked at her like she was insane. Rebecca was particularly opposed, pointing out that Hartwell had the power to destroy all of them with a single report. But Mary was insistent. They couldn't run forever, and they couldn't stop doing what was right just because it was dangerous. Eventually, reluctantly, Rebecca agreed to let Mary try. If it went wrong, she would take full responsibility, claim she was acting alone, protect the others. It was a death sentence if Hartwell turned on her. But Mary had stopped worrying about her own survival months ago. She arranged to meet Hartwell alone, told him she had information about the supply discrepancies he was investigating. They met in his office at the base headquarters, a small room with a fan that barely moved the thick air. Hartwell was in his 40s, graying at the temples, with the tired eyes of someone who had spent too long pushing papers in a war zone. Mary sat across from him and made a decision that would change both their lives. She told him everything: the network, the nurses involved, the supplies they had moved, the lives they had saved. She showed him her notebook with its careful records of patients and outcomes. She explained their reasoning, their protocols, their desperate attempts to do the right thing in a system that often prevented it. And then she waited for him to decide whether she had just saved the network or destroyed it. Hartwell sat in silence for a long time, reading through Mary's notes, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and strained. He told her that what she had described was a clear violation of military law, that any one of a dozen charges could be brought against her and the others, that he should immediately report this to his superiors and recommend court-martial proceedings. Mary nodded, accepting this, ready for whatever came next. But then Hartwell did something she hadn't expected. He asked her a question. He wanted to know about one specific entry in her notebook, a soldier named Private First Class Michael Torres, who had been treated in February for severe wounds from a rocket attack. Mary remembered Torres clearly, a kid from Texas who should have lost his leg but didn't because they had access to a newer antibiotic that wasn't supposed to be at their hospital yet. Hartwell was quiet for another moment, and then he said that Michael Torres was his nephew. The boy had written home about the nurse who saved his leg, about how grateful he was to still be whole. Hartwell had that letter in his desk drawer, read it sometimes when the bureaucracy got to be too much, and now he understood why the supplies hadn't added up. If you've made it this far, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. These stories of forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, and subscribing helps make sure more people hear them. All right, back to Mary's story. Hartwell made a choice that day that was just as brave as anything the nurses had done. He told Mary that he would file his audit report showing minor inefficiencies and recommended procedural improvements, nothing that would trigger deeper investigation. He would not mention the network, would not expose the nurses, would not stop what they were doing. But he also couldn't officially help them, couldn't be seen as complicit if they were ever discovered. All he could do was look the other way and hope they were careful. Mary thanked him with tears in her eyes, understanding the risk he was taking, the career he was potentially sacrificing. Hartwell just shook his head and said he was tired of a system that valued paperwork over people. Then he told her to get out of his office before he changed his mind. The network continued operating, more carefully now, aware of how close they had come to exposure. Mary's role expanded. She became one of the primary coordinators, helping Rebecca manage the complex logistics of moving supplies across the country. She developed relationships with helicopter pilots who were willing to make unofficial runs, with supply sergeants who could massage inventory numbers, with Vietnamese civilians who could transport materials through channels the military didn't control. She learned to think 3 steps ahead, to anticipate problems before they occurred, to build redundancies into every operation, and the lives saved continued to add up. 2,000 patients by the end of 1968, 3,000 by mid-1969, each one a small victory against the chaos and waste of war. But Mary was changing too. The work was taking a toll that she hadn't anticipated. She was sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night, running on coffee and adrenaline, and the desperate need to keep going. She had lost weight, developed a persistent cough from the dust and smoke, started having nightmares about soldiers she couldn't save despite all her efforts. Other nurses noticed and worried, told her to slow down, to take care of herself. Mary would smile and promise to rest soon, and then immediately throw herself back into the work. The truth was she couldn't slow down. Every moment she rested was a moment someone might die needlessly. Every break she took was a potential failure of her duty. She had become addicted to the mission, to the feeling of making a real difference, to the knowledge that she was part of something that mattered. It was destroying her, but she couldn't stop. The breaking point came in August 1969, during what would later be called the Battle of Heap Duke. The fighting was intense and prolonged, lasting nearly 2 weeks, and the casualties poured into the 71st faster than ever before. Mary worked 72 hours straight during the worst of it, barely stopping even to use the bathroom, sustained by nothing but determination and the hands of nurses who would physically turn her around and point her at the next patient. She saved lives during those 3 days that she would never be able to count, made decisions under pressure that would haunt her forever, and pushed her body past limits she didn't know existed. When the battle finally ended and the wounded stopped coming, Mary collapsed, just fell down in the middle of the triage area, her body simply giving up. They carried her to a bed, hooked her up to fluids, treated her for exhaustion and dehydration and the beginning stages of pneumonia. Patricia sat beside her and said what they both knew. Mary couldn't keep going like this. She needed to go home. But Mary refused. She had 9 months left on her deployment, 9 months where she could still make a difference, still save lives. She promised to rest more, to take better care of herself, to be smarter about her limits. Patricia didn't believe her, but didn't have the authority to send her home against her will. So Mary stayed, and the work continued, and the network kept operating. But something had shifted. The close call had made the military more watchful, more suspicious of irregularities. New oversight procedures were implemented. Surprise audits became common. The space for creative solutions was shrinking, and the risk of discovery was growing. The nurses adapted, became even more careful, found new ways to move supplies without leaving traces, but they all felt the walls closing in. The end came in November 1969, but not the way anyone expected. There was no dramatic raid, no sudden exposure, no triumphant reveal of their operations. Instead, it happened quietly, almost gently, in a way that was somehow worse than punishment would have been. Rebecca was transferred stateside suddenly, given a teaching position at Walter Reed with no explanation. 2 other core members of the network received similar reassignments within a week. Then 3 more. The pattern was obvious. Someone in the military hierarchy knew about the network, or at least suspected enough to act. But instead of prosecuting them, instead of court-martials and prison time, the decision had been made to simply dismantle the operation by scattering the nurses involved. It was strategic and effective. Without the coordinators, without the established relationships and protocols, the network couldn't function. It died not with a bang, but with a whisper of transferred orders and career reassignments. Mary waited for her own transfer, but it didn't come. She remained at the 71st, continued her regular duties, watched as the gaps in care that the network had filled began to reappear. Supplies went back to moving through official channels only, which meant delays and shortages and soldiers suffering needlessly. Mary tried to continue some of the work alone, but without the network's support and resources, she could only do so much. It was maddening to have seen what was possible and then be forced back into a system she knew was inadequate. She started taking bigger risks, pushing boundaries more openly, no longer caring as much about the consequences. If they were going to send her home anyway, she might as well make it count. In January 1970, Mary got her transfer orders, but they weren't what she expected. She wasn't being sent to a teaching position or a stateside hospital. She was being reassigned to a tiny field hospital near the DMZ, a forward operating position that saw constant casualties and had minimal oversight. It was technically a promotion in terms of responsibility, but everyone knew it was actually a punishment detail, a way of sidelining a problematic nurse while keeping her in-country where she could be watched. Mary accepted the orders without complaint and reported to her new assignment. The facility was even more primitive than the 71st, just a few tents and some medical equipment, staffed by a skeleton crew of medics and 1 other nurse. But Mary threw herself into the work with the same intensity she had brought to everything else. She treated casualties, trained medics, improvised solutions when supplies ran short. She did her job brilliantly and without complaint, even as she felt herself being slowly erased from the larger narrative of the war. The strangest part was the silence. None of the nurses from the network contacted her, which made sense given that they were probably being monitored. But there was also no official acknowledgement of what they had done, no investigation, no questions. It was as if the entire operation had never existed, as if the thousands of lives they had saved had occurred through normal channels. Mary tried to file reports about the network's successes, tried to document what they had achieved, thinking that maybe if the military understood the value of what they had done, they might implement some of the changes systematically. Her reports were accepted, filed, and apparently never read. She wrote letters to Patricia, to Rebecca, to Major Hartwell, hoping for some kind of closure or explanation. The letters came back unopened, address unknown. The message was clear. The network had been disappeared, and everyone associated with it was being encouraged to forget it had ever existed. Mary finished her deployment in April 1970 and returned to the United States. She received an honorable discharge, a few standard commendations for her service, and a quiet suggestion that she might want to consider a career outside of military nursing. She took the hint, moved back to Baltimore, and tried to return to civilian life. But Vietnam didn't let go easily. She had nightmares about patients she couldn't save, flashbacks to the sound of incoming helicopters, moments where she would wake up thinking she was back in the triage area. She tried to talk about the network, about what they had accomplished, but no one seemed interested. Veterans groups didn't want to hear about nurses breaking rules, even if it saved lives. The Army Nurse Corps wanted to distance itself from any controversy. The media was focused on the anti-war movement and didn't have space for complicated stories about nurses trying to fix a broken system from the inside. Mary felt like she was screaming into a void, like the most important thing she had ever done was being systematically erased. For a long time, Mary lived quietly. She worked night shifts at a small Baltimore hospital, married briefly and divorced quietly, learned how to smile at polite questions and give polite answers in return. To her co-workers, she was competent, reserved, a little distant. To her patients, she was kind in a way that felt practiced, almost deliberate. She never talked about Vietnam unless pressed, and even then, she edited the truth down to something manageable. She learned how to carry the weight without letting it show, because letting it show only made people uncomfortable. Years passed, then decades. The war faded into history books and documentaries, reduced to dates, battles, and political arguments. Mary watched it all from a distance, recognizing almost nothing of what she had lived through. The nurses were footnotes at best. The underground network didn't exist at all. The thousands of lives saved were counted as statistical improvements, attributed to better logistics, better planning, better leadership. Paperwork won. People disappeared. It wasn't until the late 1990s that something changed. Mary was nearing retirement when she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten in a careful, familiar script. Mary, I don't know if you'll want to hear from me after all these years. I hope you do. There's something happening and your name came up. We were never supposed to exist, but some people are finally asking the right questions. If you're willing, I think it's time. It was signed simply, Rebecca. They met a month later in a quiet diner outside Washington, D.C. Rebecca had gray in her hair now, deeper lines around her eyes, but she was unmistakably the same woman. Over coffee that went cold between them, she explained. A group of military historians and medical ethicists were researching unofficial medical adaptations during Vietnam. Fragmented records, anomalies, survivor testimonies that didn't match official explanations. The story kept pointing to nurses, to coordination that wasn't supposed to be possible, to outcomes that couldn't be explained by policy alone. For the first time in nearly 30 years, someone wanted to listen. Mary hesitated. She had spent most of her life learning how to forget, how to survive silence. Speaking now felt dangerous in a different way. Not to her career or her freedom, but to the fragile balance she had built inside herself. But she thought about the notebook she had hidden for decades, the one she had never been able to throw away, the names, the dates, the proof that they had been real. So she said yes. The process took years, depositions, interviews, cross-referencing faded records with personal letters, medical logs, and the memories of men who had survived, because someone had bent the rules at exactly the right moment. Many of the nurses never came forward. Some were dead, some refused, afraid of reopening old wounds. But enough spoke, enough evidence surfaced. The outline of the network emerged, incomplete, but undeniable. There was no apology from the military, no official admission of wrongdoing. But there was acknowledgement. In 2006, a quiet ceremony was held at the Army Medical Department Museum. No press, no speeches broadcast on television. Just a small group of aging nurses, a few former soldiers, and a plaque mounted on a wall most visitors never noticed. It didn't name the network. It didn't describe the rule-breaking. It simply honored medical personnel whose extraordinary initiative and moral courage saved lives under extreme conditions. Mary stood at the back of the room, her hands shaking, tears running freely down her face. For the first time, she felt something loosen inside her. Not closure, not peace, but recognition. Proof that it had mattered. Years later, after Mary died quietly in her sleep at 82, her niece found the notebook while sorting through her belongings. She donated it to an archive where it sits now, restricted but preserved. Historians still debate it. Lawyers still argue over its implications. But the names remain, thousands of them. Each one a life that continued because a group of nurses decided that compassion was more important than compliance. Mary Catherine Jenkins never became famous. She never received medals or public praise. But somewhere in Texas and Ohio and California and hundreds of other places, there are families who exist because she and others like her chose to act. And that, in the end, is how real history survives. Not in headlines or monuments, but in lives quietly allowed to go on.